Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of John Thomas Sweeney in the murder of actress Dominique Dunne. This case was recommended by friend of the show, Craig Packer. Thank you, Craig, for the case recommendation. So let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Dominique Ellen Dunne was born on November 23, 1959. She was born and raised in Santa Monica, California by her parents, Ellen and Dominic. Her father was a writer, producer, and actor. Dominique had two older brothers, Alexander and Griffin. Their parents divorced in 1967. Dominique attended Harvard Westlake School in Los Angeles, Taft School in Watertown, Connecticut, and Fountain Valley School in Fountain, Colorado. After graduation, she began to study acting and appeared in many stage productions, such as West Side Story, The Mousetrap, and My Three Angels. She made her on-screen debut with the television film Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker. She then starred in a recurring role playing Erica on the drama series Family. She also played the role of Paulina Bornstein on the comedy series Breaking Away. Dominique, however, is most known for her role as Dana Freeland in the 1982 film Poltergeist. This led to many opportunities, such as roles in The Shadow Riders and Chips. In 1981, Dominique met John Sweeney at a party. John, born in 1956, was a sous chef at a restaurant called Ma Maison. After a few weeks of dating, they moved in together in a one-bedroom house on Rangerley Avenue in West Hollywood. However, the relationship was rocky from the very beginning. John was extremely jealous and extremely possessive. They started to frequently fight, and John began to physically abuse Dominique. One time during an argument on August 27, 1982, John yanked handfuls of her hair out by the roots. Dominique left and went to her mother's home, while John showed up and began to bang on the door and windows, demanding to be let in. Dominique's mother told him to leave and threatened to call the police, so he left. A few days later, Dominique returned to the home she shared with John. They got back together. September 26, 1982. During an argument, John grabbed Dominique by her throat, threw her to the floor, and began to strangle her. There was a friend who happened to be staying with them, and the friend heard, quote, loud gagging sounds, end quote, and ran into the room where they saw Dominique being assaulted. Dominique told the friend that John had tried to kill her, but John denied it and insisted that Dominique just go back to bed. Well, she pretended to go back to bed, but first went to use the bathroom. She snuck out of the bathroom window. She tried to get away in her car, but John heard the start of the engine, ran out, and jumped on the hood of her car. Dominique stopped the car, and when John jumped off the hood, at that point, she was able to drive away. For the next few days, she stayed with her mother and stayed with various friends. She then called John and ended their relationship. Well, John moved out and Dominique had the locks changed. At that point, she moved back in. October 30th, 1982. Dominique was in her home rehearsing for an upcoming role with actor David Packer. John showed up at the home. After they spoke through a locked door, Dominique agreed to speak to him on the porch, while her friend David remained inside. Once outside, they began to argue. David later said he heard smacking sounds, 2 screams, and a thud. Well, he called the police out of concern, but the police told him Dominique's home was out of their jurisdiction. So David called a friend and told him if he was found dead, John Sweeney was his killer. When David went outside, through the back entrance, he approached the driveway and he noticed John in some nearby bushes. He was kneeling over Dominique. John told David to call the police. When the police arrived, John was still in the driveway. He put his hands in the air and said, quote, "I killed my girlfriend," end quote. He was immediately arrested and charged with attempted murder. Dominique was transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, and she was placed on life support. Doctors performed brain scans and revealed that due to loss of oxygen, she had no brain activity. November 4th, 1982, after being in a coma for 5 days, Dominique passed away. John was now charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. He was also later charged with assault with intent to do great bodily harm when during a preliminary trial hearing, he admitted that he and Dominique had a physical altercation on September 26, 1982. This was the day before she filmed the Hill Street Blues episode. She appeared in that episode with visible bruises on her face and body. While John tried to minimize his involvement, he claimed she accidentally got those bruises when he tried to prevent her from leaving their home. August 1983, John's trial began. During the trial, John took the stand in his own defense. What he stated was he and Dominique, they'd gotten back together and were planning on moving back in together and were having daily discussions about getting married and having children. On the night of October 30th, she'd abruptly changed her mind and told him she'd been leading him on and lying to him about them really getting back together. At that point, John stated he, quote, exploded and lunged toward her, end quote. He said he had no memory of attacking Dominique until he discovered he was on top of her with his hands around her neck. He then realized she wasn't breathing, so he attempted to revive her and made her walk around, but she fell down. He tried to give her CPR, but that caused her to vomit. He then said he also vomited, ran into Dominique's home, consumed 2 bottles of pills, went back into the driveway, laid next to her, and waited for the pills to take effect, and he would kill himself. John's defense lawyer argued that John's actions were neither premeditated nor executed with malice. He acted in the, quote, heat of passion, end quote. Dominique's family completely disputed John's claims. They stated she had not gotten back together with him. They insisted that on October 30th, John showed up at her home to try to get back together with her, even though she told him their breakup was permanent. The prosecution and police also dismissed John's version of events. There was no physical evidence that he had consumed any pills in an attempt to commit suicide at the time of his arrest. In fact, the police testified that when they arrived on the scene, John was, quote, calm and collected, end quote. Deputy Frank D'Amelio, the first officer that arrived on the scene, testified that John told him, quote, man, I blew it. I killed her. I didn't think I choked her that hard, but I don't know. I just kept choking her. I lost my temper and blew it again, end quote. The medical examiner that performed Dominique's autopsy determined she'd been strangled for at least 3 minutes. The prosecution then called one of John's ex-girlfriends, Lillian Pierce, to testify. However, she testified when the jury was not in the room. Lillian stated that her and John dated on and off for 3 years, from 1977 to 1980. During that time of their relationship, he assaulted her on at least 10 occasions. Twice of those occasions, she was hospitalized for the injuries she sustained. She had gotten, for example, a perforated eardrum and a collapsed lung. On another assault, she suffered a broken nose. During Lillian's testimony, John became so enraged that he jumped up from his seat and tried to run towards the judge's chamber doors. Well, he was subdued by 2 bailiffs and 4 armed guards. He was then handcuffed to his chair, began to cry, and apologized to the court for his outbursts. The defense requested that the judge rule Lillian's testimony as inadmissible, as it was, quote, prejudicial, end quote. The judge granted this request. The jury only learned about Lillian's testimony after the trial. The judge also refused to allow testimony from Dominique's mother, Ellen, as well as Dominique's friends. He cited that their statements about John's abusive nature was only hearsay. August 29, 1983, John's defense attorney requested that the judge rule out the charge of first-degree murder, saying that the court lacked sufficient evidence to really try John. Well, the judge granted this request. So jurors were instructed to consider charges of only manslaughter or second-degree murder. September 21st, 1983, after 8 days of deliberation, the jury acquitted John Sweeney on second-degree murder, but found him guilty of manslaughter. He was also convicted of misdemeanor assault for the altercation between him and Dominique on September 26, 1982. Dominique's family was outraged by the verdict. After the judge excused the jury and commented that the judicial system was upheld, Dominique Dunne yelled, quote, "Not for our family, Judge Katz," end quote. Before leaving the courtroom, Dominique Dunne accused the judge of purposely withholding John's ex-girlfriend's testimony from the jury, which would have helped to establish his violent history with women. November 7th, 1983, John was sentenced to only 6 years in prison for manslaughter. That was the maximum sentence he could receive. He got an additional 6 months for the prior assault charge. Judge Katz criticized the jury's verdict of manslaughter, saying that he felt Dominique's death was, quote, a case of pure and simple murder with malice. The jury foreman, named Paul Spiegel, later told the media he was surprised and shocked by the judge's comment, calling it a cheap shot. He felt the judge's comment stemmed from the harsh criticism he'd received from that verdict. Spiegel went on to say that had the jury been provided the opportunity to hear all evidence, they would have convicted John Sweeney of murder. John was incarcerated at a medium security prison in Susansville, California. Dominique Dunne kept a journal throughout the trial. His journal writings were later published in the March 1984 issue of Vanity Fair in an article called Justice, a father's account of the trial of his daughter's killer. A year after her daughter's death, Ellen Dunne founded Justice for Homicide Victims. This was a victims' rights advocate group. September 1986, John was released on parole. He only served 3 years, 7 months, and 27 days out of his 6.5-year sentence. John was then hired as head chef at an upscale restaurant in Santa Monica, California. Well, the Dunne family learned where John was working and began to stand outside the restaurant, handing out flyers to all patrons that read, quote, "The food you will eat tonight was cooked by the hands that killed Dominique Dunne," end quote. John eventually quit his job due to protests from the Dunne family. He then moved away from Los Angeles completely. In the mid-1990s, Dominique Dunne was contacted by a Florida physician. He came across an article from Dominique that wrote about his daughter's death. The doctor told Dominique that his daughter recently became engaged to a chef by the name of John Sweeney. Was this the same John Sweeney? Well, it was. To protect the young woman that was now engaged to John, Dominique's brother Griffin, he contacted the woman and asked her to reconsider her decision. John became outraged and accused the Dunne family of harassing him. And in an effort to avoid further altercations, he changed his name. He is now known as John Mora. Dominique's brother Griffin said of his sister, quote, "If she had lived, she'd be an actress everyone in the world would know," end quote. Dominique said this of his daughter. "The major experience of my life has been the murder of my daughter. I never truly understood the meaning of the word devastation until I lost her," end quote. That is the case of John Sweeney in the murder of actress Dominique Dunne. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Danny After Dark. Do you have any questions or comments on the case? We'll leave it down below. Let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you would like me to cover? We'll leave it down below, and you may see it featured in another episode. And once again, thank you to Craig Packer for this case recommendation. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.